Odunze, Xavier Worthy, and other early wide receiver talk. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his fantastic work over at RotoViz, including a recent piece where he... I want to read you the title. I always got to look up the title because there's 17 words in all of Shawn's titles. The Big Gorilla Blueprint, top 200 rankings, 11 tiers, 41 priority targets, and the complete game plan. He wrote about in the introduction how he spent more time on this piece than he has on pretty much any in a long time. It is what it says it is. It's a look at his current rankings here in May, targets, fades, relative to ADP, tiered out, and then notes on basically every single player, why they are ranked where they are. I mean, it's a behemoth. I have not read through the whole thing. I talk about it sometimes that I'm afraid of getting too much of exposure to Shawn's thoughts this early in the offseason. I want to do my projections. I want to do my own stuff first. But no, I read through the first several tiers, 3 or 4 tiers to the early rounds. We've already discussed many of them. Some really good stuff in there, Shawn. A fantastic piece. And you're kind of just handing over all the answers. So that's always useful.
It was quite the project. As I think I mentioned last week that even though you and I obviously write multiple things during the week in season, we watch all the games, we talk to each other about all the games. In this mission to write a blurb about all 200 players, so it's all the veteran players, because I didn't want to just replicate all the rookie work that's available in the other articles. I learned a lot that, there's still so much to try and understand every player. And I do think that understanding every player, at least again, to a certain level of scope, was helpful. And it did change my mind on a few guys. And Ben, today we're going to see if we can change each other's minds, or if we're just both right, or if the fantasy community is right, or if there are some exploitable guys in this wide receiver group in the first handful of rounds. We've been talking a lot on recent shows about running backs. Today, as you mentioned, we're going to jump into some wide receivers.
Yeah, we were talking before the show about a number of topics, as usual, and we got to talk about Odunze a little bit. I know he's one that people are curious about. This time last year, you and I were arguing about Odunze as he related to Xavier Worthy outside the sort of top tier, whether a lot of people had Odunze in that same tier as Nabers. You sort of all along last year had Nabers ahead of Harrison and felt like there was a gap down to Odunze. And then for a while, or maybe throughout, had Xavier Worthy ahead of Odunze. Some concerns about Odunze's profile. I think his rookie year really backed that up. I was talking to you about, I was a little bit defensive of him as a UW guy, but in part because watching him in an offense that had a lot going for it in 2023 at the University of Washington with Penix and the Kalen DeBoer system that I was a big fan of. And it's hard to parse why that team was so good, was one of the issues. I wasn't as confident in Jalen Polk or Jalen McMillan, but the main reason I was confident in Odunze was he was so clearly the star, the main guy, the guy they went to on key downs, and seemed to impose as well and have the ability to do that. He just didn't seem to have the ability to do that as a rookie when you watch through the whole season. There's just really no other way to put it. The numbers are not great, 1.14 targets or yards per out run. There are, I think, some mitigating factors there. You and I was just going through NFL Pro, a bunch of clips of him. We were looking for a play that you had remembered that I didn't quite remember I wanted to find. And so we spent about 15 minutes just now looking at a bunch of incompletions to Odunze. And one of the things we did agree on was, is one of the things that I think a lot of people have talked about with Odunze was that a lot of the plays that didn't work out for him last year were just poorly thrown balls. That Caleb missed quite a few opportunities. We found a couple of these, but several I recall hole shots between a cover 2 cornerback, kind of letting him free up the sideline. And before a safety got down, there were multiple opportunities that we found just in the couple games that we were looking kind of mid to late in the season. We were looking through trying to find this particular play that that you knew was sort of mid to late in the season. And there were a couple of those cover two, zone beaters. But I mean, Caleb missed that throw several times. I know he missed it to Keenan Allen a couple times, but he missed it to Odunze probably a handful of times. And you're looking at these plays and you're like, man, if he makes some of these throws, Odunze's numbers are meaningfully better. But there's a lot of other opportunities where he just didn't seem to create a whole lot of separation. The play that you were discussing, we did wind up finding, is one where he breaks behind a linebacker about 25 yards downfield. Caleb throws with some anticipation to the other side of the linebacker, and as Odunze comes around, he has to kind of jump a little, but didn't really need to too much. The ball's right on his face mask, and it kind of just goes through his hands. You were theorizing that maybe, he lost sight of the ball as he kind of came around that linebacker, but nonetheless, it was a clear drop and on what could have been a touchdown. So some of the stuff was on Odunze as well on some of the missed opportunities. As I was looking for the play, I found another one where he caught a ball on a scramble drill in the corner of the end zone, and then I think he was ruled to have stepped out of bounds. That's obviously on Odunze. That's a mental error there, but he had a reception in the end zone that got wiped away for potential TD. There was one other drop that came up a couple times, a quick slant in tight against the Texans in the end zone. Point being, probably three opportunities that, if you go looking for Rome Odunze drops, that could have been more placed on him, that would have been touchdowns. But a lot of opportunities where he's open and there's a play there. And I mean, an NFL quarterback just has to make these throws. I mean, that's kind of the way you put it as well. He's a really fascinating guy because we're talking about him in the context of dynasty. I've given some, I was mentioning to you, I gave a buddy some advice that he plays in a league up here in Seattle. And so there's a lot of UW kind of homerism. It's like he had Odunze and he was thinking about trading him. And I'm like, you probably want to pursue that. He ended up being able to trade him for a first round pick in this year's rookie draft and a first next year. So his value had somehow increased despite a pretty disappointing rookie year. We've talked about this before as far as dynasty strategy goes. You want to be making those bets if you can. That's an opportunity to get into a different first-round player that maybe in their rookie year shows that they're a superstar, right? Like that's the only way in dynasty you can really get these superstars on your roster is drafting them through in an affordable way, is drafting them through the rookie draft.
Yeah, Jamar Chase, Brian Thomas now.
Yeah, you're not going to get Brian Thomas now. You're going to have to pay multiple first. Jamar Chase was Jamar Chase rookie year. Justin Jefferson was Justin Jefferson rookie year. Rome Odunze was not that. It doesn't mean that he can't become good. It does probably mean that he's not going to become that. I mean, it just genuinely does. There's a lot of data that shows that you have a rookie year like Rome Odunze did, and you're probably not Jamar Chase. I mean, players like that tend to transcend their situations, even if their situations are bad. But that doesn't mean that Odunze can't be good. So he's a very fascinating player going into year two. And there is context that's in his favor, that a lot of the things that didn't go right for him in year one, maybe not entirely his fault. He's an interesting one. What are you thinking about Odunze as we go towards year two here?
Well, you touched on a lot of the concerns that I had in that the profile for me, and it's interesting because I've been looking at a lot of the next gen numbers. They have some fascinating grades on some different players. I was talking with Connor O'Driscoll a little bit about it yesterday. He was looking some things up for me, exactly how they're doing some of their work there. And their production score, as we understand it, is a machine learning grade that also then incorporates the scouting grade. I'm like, you've now put together these things that are very different that I don't know exactly where we're getting some of this information or how high the machine is on him versus the scouts. One of the things that it seemed to me like the scouts were almost certainly way too high on him based on having this really strong final season at age 21 there for Washington, where you play in 15 games, but yes, you go for over 1,600 yards, you catch 13 touchdowns. There's no way, shape, or form in which that is a bad season, but just to, create some context with, one of the other players that we're kind of looking at here, when you look at the, touchdowns per game, when you're looking at touchdown share, when you're looking at yardage share, when you're looking at yards per team attempt, when you're looking at Dominator, and you can, each one of those different types of things gives you some different information. I'm not saying like heavily prioritize one or the other. Xavier Worthy did that season as an 18-year-old true freshman at Texas. Now, because it was only 12 games, because the offense wasn't as high powered, the raw numbers are not quite as high. But that's one of the reasons why the context is helpful there as we think through it. Now, the thing for Worthy is that his trajectory, if anything, went in the other direction. I'm not necessarily suggesting that that's good either. If either of these players had had a second season that matched their peak season, then I think they would have been worthy top 10 picks. But especially when you're thinking about Worthy, you're thinking about these fast guys. I want to see that early breakout when you're talking about Odunze, the more big, almost Megatron-like. Although, again, I mean, one of the things about Megatron was that he gets that label because he was another sort of order of magnitude different from everyone else when you're talking about size and speed, right? But for Odunze, I do want to see the final season. The final season was good. I just thought that it was very clear that we have this gap between the profiles for Nabers and Harrison versus his profile. So, if we're going to look at it as three different groups, that would be fine. Again, I liked Worthy maybe better than I should have. But when we look at both of those guys then and think through what they did as rookies, that play that I had remembered, and I don't want to one play to determine how I view someone ever. And then certainly as we were watching that, as you mentioned, I was saying, well, maybe the whole thing looked bad because he loses sight of the ball, tracking behind the defender. But you go in and you break down these stats as a rookie, and he just wasn't dynamic. And so then again, as we contrast the two players, one of the things that Odunze had to deal with was a rookie quarterback who was struggling. That pass and some of those passes that you mentioned that he missed, I mean, they're wide open passes where there's also no pressure. I mean, an NFL quarterback has to make those plays. You're dealing with that. You're dealing with a coordinator who gets fired. He was that bad. You're dealing with elite target competition in DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. You contrast that with Worthy, who plays in an offense with Andy Reid, with Patrick Mahomes. And then you lose that target competition from Rashee Rice early in the season, and yet it still takes to the very end to get going. Now, we know that the backstory there is he more or less misses 7 touchdowns, that each individual touchdown probably should have happened. You wouldn't expect all 7 to happen, but to not get any of those pretty dramatically shifts how we see his rookie season. And one of the things about the Super Bowl, and the Super Bowl is obviously controversial because the scores happen in garbage time, but they are a reminder that the idea that Xavier Worthy is going to run these deep patterns and Patrick Mahomes is simply going to miss him every time throughout the rest of their careers is not the way that it will work, right? So we have that element as well. And then you look at Worthy with the last 3 games in the regular season, doesn't really play in week 18, and then the 3 playoff games. But he goes on a 6-game run where he averages over 21 fantasy points per game. It's a meaningful stretch to finish out what you were as a rookie. And then, as you've mentioned, it's going to be 22 next year. That also, when we think about taking the next step, is very meaningful. Then the other thing that we have to deal with for Odunze is that a lot of the problems that he had as a rookie contextually are going to still be there. Now, the thing that makes it so exciting is that he could take this big leap. If Caleb Williams takes a big leap, we certainly expect the coaching to be far, far, far better. But the problem that he is going to continue to deal with is similar. And I think it's an interesting kind of contrast when you're thinking about it relative to Jameson Williams. I mean, Odunze is basically Jameson Williams pre-breakout. But once he breaks out, he will still have to deal with this problem that Williams has to deal with, which is that there are too many mouths to feed in this offense to really have the ceiling that you would want to have. It's interesting then when we look at some of the post-NFL draft dynasty ADP coming out of startups in the RV Triflex format, where Odunze is going at wide receiver 19, Xavier Worthy is going at wide receiver 20. And I think in order, again, to have the full context, Luther Burden, wide receiver 28, Jameson Williams, wide receiver 29, I think we have good reason to believe that those gaps, and it's not a huge gap necessarily in terms of wide receiver ordering, but it's multiple rounds once you throw the other positions in, right? Those gaps don't make a lot of sense based on the feedback that we have, even if we're still mildly optimistic about Odunze being a good player and taking a meaningful step in year 2.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one because it exists on a spectrum that I think is sometimes hard to quantify or even conceptualize. It's easy to say, look, a lot of the passes that he was thrown in year 1 were not good enough, that Shane Waldron was completely out of his depth in terms of the way that they designed this offense, in terms of its implementation. I talked a lot on the show during the season, and I didn't want to double count Caleb Williams' struggles. I wanted to basically just chalk it up to this entire offense was conceived poorly. They probably weren't coaching the right things. I remember I made a ship analogy a few times with you that, like, as he's getting off course, there's no one to steer it back because there's just they ended up firing the offensive coordinator, then the head coach, and then they have I can't even remember which position coach became the new acting head coach, but who's there coaching the quarterback at that point? All the guys that installed the offense are gone. They're trying to run a playbook. The coaches that are left are trying to run a playbook that probably was poorly conceived in the first place, and the guys who conceived it are gone now, right? And so part of the discussion that we were having in season at that point was, this is, for me, the issue was, this is why it's so important that you get the coaching decisions right in the first place, because you had the wrong coaching decisions. You have the wrong guys in place. They're bad. You fire them because they're bad, because there's nothing else you can do. Bears historically had never really fired anybody in season, and there was a lot of people saying that wasn't going to happen. It got so bad that they had to. I mean, it got so bad around like Thanksgiving. I remember there was a horrible stretch right around Thanksgiving. They went ahead and fired these guys in the season because they just had to. But then who does that leave? And if the people below them are even as poorly equipped, and if those coaches didn't create a great staff, then you're just making it even worse. You don't even have the people in place. Anyway, I've said this 3 different ways, but I think it's worth emphasizing that it makes things very difficult on young players, as you were mentioning. And yet, that said, transcendent players tend to transcend, right? Like, they tend to be good enough, even if the situation isn't great. I think they make the situation look more right than it probably is sometimes, right? They make things work. Caleb Williams, I mean, and the big thing about some of these throws that we were talking about, that we were just watching, is they're clean pockets. I mean, a lot of it was, he took the league high sacks, a massive number of sacks. I had the number here in front of me a second ago because I'm looking at some piece I wrote on the Bears right after they hired Ben Johnson, but he took, I think it was like 68 sacks, whatever it was. It was like 16 more than any other quarterback is the point. It was way, way more than, I think it was CJ Stroud was number 2. The situation was not a good offense for really anything. And yet some of these throws that Caleb was missing were also situations where he was completely protected. There's an open receiver. He has a place to put the ball, maybe because everything else is going wrong, and how that influences the preparation and everything on the game day. He's sped up or he's missing. And that's again, what I talked about in season, was not wanting to double count and not wanting to hold too much against a guy that was in a situation that was so dysfunctional, clearly dysfunctional. And now you're going to Ben Johnson, who everybody really loves and thinks is a really intelligent, not just designer of an offense, but probably like leader to some degree. Maybe it's all Dan Campbell, but Jared Goff is a fascinating name here, Shawn. In this article, I brought up Trevor Lawrence as well. Trevor Lawrence's rookie year was under Urban Meyer was a complete catastrophe for everyone involved. That Jacksonville year, one of the more similar or most similar things that we could draw to what it was with the Bears last year, where it was just clear that this was not a coach that was in the right place to be coaching a number one overall pick and developing the new era of this franchise. Lawrence was the first overall pick that year. Everything went poor. Urban Meyer gets fired in season. I get similar owners who didn't seem to want to fire him in season, even after a couple issues. He kicked a player or something. There was the thing in the bar after the Thursday night game in Ohio with the young lady. And then I think eventually, maybe it was the kicking the player that eventually is what got him fired. I can't remember, but it was like multiple things.
He's like, I really want to emphasize I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, he really wanted to get fired too. It was like he should have been fired multiple times. Is the point I'm trying to make. The Trevor Lawrence point is that, okay, everything was really bad for Trevor Lawrence at the time. I wanted to make a lot of exceptions for Lawrence and a lot of excuses. But then ask yourself whether Trevor Lawrence has lived up to what he was supposed to be, even under Doug Peterson, right?
Well, has he gotten a second coach fired?
Yeah, he has. And yet, I think there's a point here that can be made about potentially Lawrence still has room to grow, because quarterbacks sometimes do take until year 5, year 6. Because the other two names I mentioned here, one was Jared Goff. His first year was under Jeff Fisher, and then he was good under McVay. But the McVay didn't think he was good enough, and he gets traded to the Lions. And then he's actually probably taken another step with the Lions and been more consistent, probably been a better mental player, I think, with the Lions than he ever was with the Rams. And again, that goes back to Ben Johnson. Mayfield's the other one, number one overall pick. Has a really good rookie year, actually. Doesn't have the same arc where the first year is sort of a disaster and the coach gets fired. Has a good rookie year, but his first 4 years as a whole were not good enough for the Browns to want to extend him or keep him. He winds up with the Panthers and then gets cut in that season, and then is with the Rams. 2 different teams in a really tough 5th year. Lands with the Bucs in his 6th year. And they're talking about he's not even clearly the QB in camp ahead of Kyle Trask going into last season, if people remember. And now, I mean, he had a 40 touchdown season last year. He looks like he's completely rehabilitated his image as a so I think Goff and Mayfield are these examples of players that could even be taken as a positive for Trevor Lawrence that weren't hits as number one overall picks in their first 4 years or first rookie contract or whatever. And it's a little bit later, year 5, year 6, where they really reach what their potential is. And maybe that's a positive for Caleb Williams as well. And yet, are any of these guys viewed as top 5 overall quarterbacks is sort of the other point. And that's, I think, when you go back to Caleb after year 1, you can throw out everything because of Shane Waldron, but you can't really throw out all of it, right? There's still the element that he should have been able to transcend a little bit more if he was a little bit better. And I do think there's reason to be somewhat concerned. And then that same point can be made for Odunze, that he should have been able to be a little bit better, even if he was missed, even if his catchable target rate was really poor, even if there was a lot of competition.
And it had to be awful because he had a 89% on target catch rate and only 54% actual completions, which gives you a sense of like just how bad those numbers were. And yet, as you kind of finish up here, all of these other different categories contrasting him with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, he more or less comes in third, certainly doesn't separate from them. Now the case can be made that, well, they're also very good. If you're even just holding your own with those players, maybe that's actually a very positive sign. But when you're talking about coming out, as you gave us the yards per route, that was third of the 3 guys. His points above average per route was third of the 3 players. His receiver rating was third of the 3 players. There are some areas where, evasion rate there was a little bit there. He was the guy who they asked to go down the field more. There are some positives to that. I mean, you can pull out some small positives here. But like you're saying, even when you sort of adjust for context, nothing jumps out to say this guy was worth a top 10 pick.
And I think the concern for his profile for you last summer, look, he was a 4-year older prospect, not an early declare, and most of his production comes kind of later, and the numbers weren't amazing. You're just kind of talking through this. It's not a fair thing from a profile perspective because Corey Davis's profile was incredible. But the concern would have been that Corey Davis, the number 5 overall pick, went on to be a pretty good NFL player. The concern would be that Odunze and where there is somewhat of a similarity, Davis wasn't an early declare. Odunze doesn't go on to be a superstar as a top 10 overall pick. He goes on to be a Corey Davis level NFL player. And I think after year one, you're like, okay, even if a lot of this stuff wasn't his fault, even if the offense was conceived poorly and his quarterback is missing him every time he's open, he didn't transcend enough for me to believe that he can shake those allegations. He could still be good, right? Now, as I gave all these comps for Caleb Williams, I had a few comps for Odunze in this, like career arc comps for Odunze in this piece. The name that I think is interesting from a positive perspective for Odunze would be Nico Collins, who had a 1.24 yards per run as a rookie. Very similar, but Collins was unique in that regard. But his rookie year, the reason it would be similar is rookie year was with Davis Mills. It was a really bad situation, bad offense, bad quarterback play. And that could explain some of the yards per out run. He got that up to 1.68 in year 2 before it took off in year 3. I think that's the other part of it for me with Odunze. When I think about redraft, even the guy like a Davante Adams, you go way back to him. He had a really tough first 2 years. But you look at his yards per route run, when it starts really low, like Adams did as well, he becomes a superstar one day. He doesn't become a superstar overnight. He scales it up. It improves from that first year a little bit, I think, to the second year, and it keeps improving. Collins had a 3+ yards per out run in his third year, if I'm not mistaken, but it did scale up from year 1 to year 2 in a pretty meaningful way. He started to show in year 2 the ability to earn some volume and be a little more efficient than he showed in year 1. I guess for redraft for me with Odunze, my concern is he was so bad last year. He's got a lot to improve on. He's got, and I don't know that that's going to happen for 2025. Even if he winds up being better than the Corey Davis from a career perspective, even if he does take a Nico Collins arc and wind up as a good player, I'm not sure I believe it'll happen in 2025. I think we'll see an improvement in 2025, but an ultimate peak coming later in his career. He's a really tough bet for me after that rookie year in redraft. And if he, as you were talking to me about when I mentioned the dynasty trade to you, if he has another bad redraft year, because there is risk that it's just bad again, or even if it's just okay, you do tend to see the dynasty value really fall after that second tough season to open a career. Like, oh, this guy's definitely not great. So right now is an opportunity for you, those of you in dynasty, to potentially, I mean, I don't think everyone's going to be able to get 2 firsts out of it. That was the kind of, again, a UW homer thing, but that's why I was like, yeah, you got to be all over that when I was talking to my buddy about his league. You can trade Odunze after the first year that he had and get a first this year and a first next year and get 2 new bets on it. But if you can even just get 1 first and the opportunity to make a new bet on a new Rome Odunze in next year's class or in this year's, if you haven't had your rookie draft yet, I do think you really want to consider that because his dynasty value probably sits in a position where it's going to be tough for him to. It sits in a position where there's kind of asymmetrical risk. There's an opportunity for it to really collapse if he has another bad year. And I don't know that the situation has changed enough, as you said, even though Ben Johnson is there, for us to expect him to suddenly be a 2+ targets per out run type of player. It's probably going to have to be a multi-year build back if he is going to wind up being a strong NFL player. So anyway, the Bears are really, really fascinating team. And those both of those rookies are really fascinating ones. You mentioned Worthy as well. And yeah, we talked a lot about them last year. And for anyone who's doing the early drafting, you're aware that Worthy is going quite a bit ahead of Odunze. But we like year 2 receivers, and these ones that have interesting small samples in year 1 are really worth digging into, I think.
And it's fascinating to look at this dynasty element versus the redraft element. To me, it just seems like dynasty managers are really fairly dramatically over anchoring to the prices people originally paid for Odunze and where he went in last year's draft. And that already you have to have recalibrated that a little bit more. So one of the things that we can do when we're contrasting ADP from different formats is that we can glean some insights that would then wash back on the other one and help us maybe exploit those. When you're looking at Xavier Worthy going multiple rounds ahead of Odunze in redraft, and is a former first-round pick who's a year younger than Odunze, there's just no way that he can't be not just ahead of Odunze, but there should be a meaningful little gap there in dynasty pricing, right? Not only can he not be behind him, but he should be ahead of him by a decent little amount. I had mentioned Jameson Williams in part because I think there are some interesting parallels there. We know that Williams had a slow start because of the injury and then arguably some off-field and then on-field elements where he probably didn't have the same kind of football character that Odunze seems to have, but yet had enough that as the Lions continued to work with him, they were able to unlock this massive potential, right? So when you're looking at Jameson Williams as a former 12th overall pick, that part of it with the two players, very, very similar. You could even argue that if not for the injury, which is now pretty clearly in the rear view, that Williams would have been drafted earlier than Odunze. But again, you're splitting hairs there. The point is that they both go very early in these drafts. Williams is a year older, right? But still in that range to where when we're valuing youth for these prospects, you shouldn't get a big discount on Williams just because he's 1 year older than Rome Odunze. And I don't know that we should get a huge difference in value based on uncertainty. One of the things that can be both a positive and negative for these young players is that they are a little bit more of a black box, even though we have a ton of information about them. But where they're going to go from this current point has such a wide range still that it makes them very fun. And we salivate at the upside, but we also have to consider what the downside is and then where they might be capped contextually, which is the reason I mentioned Williams. From that perspective, with me, with Luther Burden, even in redraft, I do wonder if the even wider range, because we have a lot less information about him specifically as a pro, that you wouldn't prefer Burden even with the weaknesses that he has. We know that he falls in the draft, but he still goes early enough to be interesting. We know he had this sensational 2023 season. We know that this new staff with the Bears liked him enough. So then as we get back to the redraft prices here, I think even with all my concerns, I don't really have a problem with Odunze being the wide receiver 37 in FFPC early redraft. He's going in the middle of round 7, sandwiched there kind of by Jordan Addison and Deebo Samuel. I guess I would say that these 49ers receivers that come later in that round, specifically Juwan Jennings, who was, Juwan Jennings was extremely productive last year, probably more so even than it feels to people, specifically for redraft. Yeah, I think you kind of have to prefer him. But once you go beyond this range, and they're talking about guys like Khalil Shakir, Stephon Diggs, Jacoby Myers, Odunze seems very reasonably priced. Like the redraft community seems to have this one right, maybe even to the point where he's kind of interesting there.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I like the Niners notes, and I'll just mention from my Target Sprout Run piece early this offseason, just coming away from that feeling. You mentioned the Juwan Jennings numbers, maybe even a little bit better than people realize. Coming away from that feeling really good about Jennings in the short term going forward. Now, even that, you have Deebo Samuel traded, and I think people are another year 2 player, and Ricky Pearsall is coming into this discussion here. He goes back to back with Jennings on FFPC right now, wide receiver 40, right behind Jennings at wide receiver 39, both in the late 7th round. I think people see Deebo get traded. They think, okay, Pearsall is the guy that's going to step into that role. And I don't think they're accounting for the fact that Jennings sort of already did. Last year, Jennings led the team with a 26% targets per route. George Kittle was second at 22%. Ayuk was at 21%. Obviously, Ayuk gets injured early in the year. A lot of what Jennings did was after Ayuk was out. And we know Ayuk's probably not going to be ready for week 1. So there's a different element here. But once Ayuk is back, you're also talking about a season where, Christian McCaffrey is certainly being drafted in a range where drafters are expecting him to play quite a bit more than he did last year. Maybe he gets hurt again, but I think you do have to consider the reality of this offense that includes Christian McCaffrey I mean, he basically didn't play in 2024. And so they needed players. Ayuk got hurt. Debo had pneumonia and wasn't great for a long stretch. Kittle has a great season in the context of that. Jennings has this massive breakout year where his target sprout's up over 25%. It's like an elite number one type of number, and he's efficient on that. His numbers were great. And in all of that context, even in some games late in the year where it seemed like Pearsall was sort of getting force-fed some volume, he winds up with only a 14% targets per route and a really pretty poor rookie year as well. And now, I guess my argument is last year, he actually didn't have a lot of competition because of all the injuries. Now, Kittle's back. Jennings is established. Ayuk's going to eventually be healthy, presumably, maybe later in the year, or maybe it's more of a 2026 point about Ayuk. Christian McCaffrey's probably going to play quite a bit more in 2025 than he did in 2024. Even if he misses half the year, he's going to have played quite a bit more. You're talking about him influencing the pass rate and then also stealing a lot of targets because he's going to get volume out of the backfield, design plays and those types of things. And when Pearsall wasn't getting design plays, he ran a lot of routes for a 4 or 5 week stretch where he just didn't get any targets at all. I mean, he had like 4 targets over 4 games where he was basically a full-time player. His first couple games after he got healthy, after the gunshot wound, definitely derailed his offseason. And you can talk about his development being stunted because of that. But once he finally got back, his first couple games, he got a lot of volume. Then he went like 4 straight games with nothing. And then late in the year, when their season was basically over and a lot of their other producers are basically on IR, he has a couple strong games to close the year. He did produce and he was efficient on those targets after the target efficiency. He was not efficient in terms of earning targets. So Pearsall to me is a sketchy one in round 7 as a year 2 bet because he wasn't a great profile. And because I do think he's going to have more competition in year 2 than he even had in year 1, and the year 1 numbers weren't even that great. So there's a long way that I think, he's got a lot of things to overcome, I guess, is the way that I would put it. But you mentioned Jennings. He's part of the reason. I think Jennings is sort of the answer to what happens to the volume that used to go to Debo Samuel. It's like, I mean, Jennings is established. He had about double the targets per route. So anyway, that's a very fascinating point. Odunze in the middle of round 7 maybe is an interesting bounce back bet. The other name, you compared him to Jameson Williams a little bit in round 6. The other name I want to compare him to in round 6 at wide receiver 30 is George Pickens. Not necessarily compare him heavily to, but Pickens is a guy that, again, you go look at what he's actually done, removing the situational stuff. Because I think the situational stuff for Pickens has been pretty poor to start his year. I don't think the quarterback play has been or to start his career. I don't think the quarterback play has been particularly good. And I don't think the offense has been particularly conducive to big wide receiver numbers. The routes have not been huge. He had 580 as a rookie, and he wasn't actually that great as a rookie. But then in year 2, 540, the routes dropped by quite a bit. The yards per out run actually scales up quite a bit. It's over 2, which is that kind of benchmark we really like to see. Again, per the Pro Football Focus numbers, Shawn and I often cite different numbers. The benchmarks are a little bit different for the different sites, SIS or PFF. But 2024, he was over 2 again in PFF's numbers, but routes were down meaningfully to 436. All 3 years, his yards per target was over 9, solid, like strong after the target efficiency. It was really his targets per out run scaling up over those years that has been the driver of how he's had better like yards per out run in the last 2 seasons than his rookie year. But it's a really good first 3 years as you see it kind of progress. And when you see the second year and the third year both be really efficient on a per route basis, and then consider that he's now going to be with the Cowboys, where you have the opportunity in an offense that doesn't necessarily have a high volume rushing attack, has a drop back game with Dak Prescott. It's not like a hyper mobile quarterback situation. There's going to be a lot of pass volume. Like that's the reason we love CeeDee Lamb. I think people see him go from Pittsburgh to Dallas and they worry about, okay, now he's the clear number 2. He maybe was a co-number 1 in Pittsburgh, but in Pittsburgh, you were talking about bottom barrel target potential. I mean, drop back potential from a team perspective. You're talking about Arthur Smith running an offense that was bottom 5 in pass volume last year, just like his offenses were with the Falcons. Part of that was because of Russell Wilson and Justin Fields and the mobility, but a big part of it is just the play calling, right? The expectation this year is that Aaron Rodgers is their quarterback, and you have a pace issue there. He runs the play clock down. He does not get a lot of snaps off per 60 minutes or what have you. So Arthur Smith plus Aaron Rodgers is just not a great combination. You're talking about very few overall dropbacks from a projection standpoint. And Pickens was going to be likely competing with DK Metcalf for what was there and then needing to thrive on efficiency. Instead, he goes to the Cowboys, where their whole issue last year was they had nobody behind CeeDee Lamb. Jalen Tolbert was a guy that we talked ourselves into a little bit, Sean, not entirely because of the profile, but because it was a situation I was talking about last year. It was kind of similar to the Rams a year prior and where Puka Nacua came out of nowhere. There was a lot of available routes and targets and opportunity. Jake Ferguson is sort of a routes-based tight end, but not somebody who has proactively earned volume at the tight end position. And then no other receiver on that roster had really any kind of profile that showed target earning ability other than Lamb. Pickens now slots into this situation where he has no competition behind Lamb. And as far as I'm concerned, he's got guys that run routes and will be replacement level target earners when they run those routes, or even below replacement level. No competition for that second target share. Lamb's going to clearly still be the number one, but I just really like Pickens now moving to an offense where his routes for the first time, or at least the first time in the last couple of years, should be able to scale up. Because, again, I mentioned as a rookie, he had 580. He had kind of a ton in 2022. The efficiency wasn't there yet. But he's been good enough these last 2 years that you like him on a per route basis, and then you look at him in a new offense and say, okay, can he run a lot more routes? Can he get enough single coverage working off of CeeDee Lamb? And does the fact that the other three eligible receivers in any given play can't earn volume, doesn't that mean that you can project Pickens for a pretty solid secondary target share behind, whatever it is that Lamb posts, 28, 29% or something ridiculous? I mean, I really like the move for Pickens in that it gives him, I think, more freedom to impact in the ways that he has shown that he's good enough to impact. High ADOT, more, because all 3 years his ADOT has been well over 13.5. I mean, I think he's a really nice play in the 7th round. And somebody like that, again, the reason I contrast that to Odunze is I think he's going from a situation that has artificially held his numbers down to one that could actually inflate his numbers and be beneficial on a per route basis, and his routes might be able to rise as well. But I think he's good, and then the situation's improving. Whereas for an Odunze type situation, I'm concerned. I guess I don't know. I mean, even if you say that Odunze was all the product of a bunch of bad pass, attempts and Caleb not finding him when he was open, it doesn't mean that we know that he was good despite that. We didn't see anything, right? So, and what we didn't see, the absence of him sort of transcending situation is like, okay, there was at least the potential for him to show that he's much better than a poor situation, and that didn't come out. He could rebound. But I mean, if I'm going to make this play in this draft range or these types of plays, I want to look for guys that I think are probably pretty good, Sean. Like I do think Pickens probably, for as weird as he is, and I think that probably explains why the Steelers were fed up with him. And maybe there's more to the off-field stuff than I'm letting on. I think people do get concerned that maybe he's not going to fit in or whatever. He's going to wind up getting benched for that. He kind of got benched a little bit late in the Pittsburgh season for effort-related stuff. I don't know. I think Dallas puts up with a lot. They put up with Ezekiel Elliott for years, all that kind of stuff. Pickens is good enough. I'm not super concerned about those issues, and I want to make the bet because I think there's a real ceiling there.
All I could really think about as you were going through that, partly a little bit of my skepticism about everything about Pickens and the effort, I think, is very troubling. But as you were describing it, I wanted to really contrast what I think is a fine situation in almost all of these offenses, where you don't really get that worried about having to share with another guy who is good. I mean, you look at Davante Smith buried there in the 5th round. I mean, he's not buried there because of A.J. Brown. I mean, he partly is, but he's buried there because the Philadelphia Eagles passing offense has some real problems from a variety of perspectives. The Lions are so unique because their number of weapons is extraordinarily high, and that they are going to soak a lot of the plays with a David Montgomery. One of the things that I should step back and say I could be easily wrong on just with the Bears is that if they aren't able to develop that player in the run game, then maybe they actually are fine for everybody. If they take the step, they would have to take the step, right? So we're starting to stack up a variety of ifs. And anytime that you have this string of ifs, you got to go back and look and be like, okay, now how much should I pay for that if I have to have all of these things fall into place more or less simultaneously? But maybe Loveland is fine. Maybe DJ Moore is fine. Maybe I want to be really in on Luther Burden, even though he probably misses. But if we have his price relative to the rest of the guys, I don't think accurately demonstrates what his risk and upside is versus the rest of that group. Once we move to a team like the Cowboys, though, I'm sitting here looking at this. You have numbers for T. Higgins, where last year his per game scoring was extremely high. He still had issues with availability, but you have that sort of touchdown bump that makes him look like a guy who, even as an injury risk, even as the massive number 2 to the best receiver in football, or one of the 2 or 3 best, certainly the one coming off the most massive season, the best combination of wide receiver and QB, that T. Higgins can still be there at the 2-3 turn. I do think that Joe Burrow is meaningfully different than Dak Prescott, but we've certainly seen Dak Prescott play well on a number of occasions. One of the reasons that CeeDee Lamb had such a massive year in 2023, when I'm looking at these receiver prices, I'm thinking to myself, I prefer T. Higgins. I think that he's better. Seems like he's probably more likable. But the gap in pricing between T. Higgins and George Pickens, massively exploitable there. And as we kind of look at the different ways you might play the season, you're always looking for these different pairings where you're like, obviously those two guys should be closer together just in terms of what their different ranges are. I mean, so much of what Pickens is likely to do overlaps with what Higgins is likely to do. And to the point where, Pickens might even have more upside.
Yeah. What I was going to ask you straight up, what would you take? I think I'm taking Pickens straight up. I like Higgins a lot. I think it's pretty wild. I mean, Jamar Chase is the number 1 overall player. Lamb is obviously an incredibly target dominant player as well. But I think Higgins, we've seen enough of over enough years to be pretty confident of what he is. And it's really good, but it's a secondary piece to what Jamar Chase is. And Pickens is going to be a secondary piece to what Lamb is. I guess what I'm saying is Pickens is young enough still that there may still be some meat on the bone from like a pure upside perspective, kind of like what we thought there was with Higgins maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and maybe don't feel as strongly, or I don't feel like he's had enough sort of okay seasons. Now, last year was really good. He only played like 9 or 10 games or whatever it was, and he was really good on a per game basis in those games, but he's had enough sort of okay seasons that I'm like, okay, well, T. Higgins probably is what he is, which is really good, but it's a secondary piece. The other big part of it for me is the Bengals have low-key had some decent third weapons. Like Yosef is actually like okay. Like, and Mike Gesicki had a decent little year last year. The Cowboys have nobody. It's hard to overstate how bad their target earning is beyond, or was beyond Lamb last year and is now beyond Pickens. When I say he has no competition for those secondary targets, I mean he has the Cowboys are terrible at building a roster. Like, it's bad. It's really, really, really bad. Like, it's as bad as it could be. You have to be trading draft capital for Jonathan Mingo in season to make it this bad and think that you're getting something out of that, right? Like, You have to actively be hurting your team building process to make it this bad. And that's an important point, I think.
Well, and if these Bengals have just a little bit of natural defensive rebound, if some of the decisions they've made in the offseason to try and not give up so many points per game, if any of those things come to fruition, then a month into the season, it's going to feel even more like we should have had, as high a percentage of Chase Brown as you could possibly have. And T. Higgins was not a good bet.
Yeah, at this cost, T. Higgins for me is manageable, but like it's not a bet that I want to make. If I saw Pickens at this cost, I actually still think I would be vaguely into it, I guess is the way to put it. I don't know. It's weird to me. It's very, very weird to me that Higgins is going at the 2-3 turn and Pickens is going mid-6 because there's a lot of similarities here. Again, you go to the per route profile stuff. Pickens, I mentioned, has 2 years of over 2 yards per out run. The last 2 years, he's coming off 2 years. Higgins has 2 in his career. Last year he was at 205. That was a bounce back from 2023 where he was down at 166. He's good. His career number is just slightly better than Pickens. But they're both like 1.85 and 1.88 for I guess for Higgins, I'm looking at 1.88. I'm looking at a 3-year average that I have in this spreadsheet. His career number appears to be just slightly better than that. But they're in this like slightly below 2 range for their career. But for Pickens, he's been over 2 the last 2 years. And that's why I say there might actually be a little bit of meat left on that bone. He's been a 2 yards per out run guy with some questionable quarterback play over the last 2 years with, mostly Russell Wilson last year. And the effort related stuff was probably related to the fact that he's playing an Arthur Smith offense. The year prior was Kenny Pickett year. I mean, he's been productive. Higgins' numbers are Higgins' numbers despite mostly playing with Joe Burrow. Pickens' numbers may actually, some of the advanced stuff you look at with Pickens too argues that he may actually be a little bit more than what we think he is at this moment in time. I love him, and I would be taking so much of him in the middle of the 6th round if I was drafting more right now. I'm not taking a ton, but he just is in bold to me in that range where I think he's multiple rounds undervalued. And yeah, you drawing that comparison to Higgins, I would take him straight up over Higgins. I just situationally, and there's I think a little bit more talent-based upside on the Higgins side. Excuse me, on the Pickens side, similar names. But I just want to make the Pickens bet so much more, but especially cost adjusted. I mean, no doubt cost adjusted.
It's worth pointing out that you're simply going to have a gigantic target share when you're running routes against Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson, Scotty Miller, Ben Skoranek. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there are some ways in which we wouldn't expect everything to translate. And I think potentially some ways in which the, almost 14, and again, you're going to get some different types of air yard numbers from different sources, but that the targets at that depth are going to be inconsistent in a way that some of the stuff that Higgins does won't be. And I do think that it's relevant to think of like how Pickens would become a star, how he would manage a situation where there were more opportunities there. He has not been a guy who does much after the catch other than if he's behind the defense and he can finish those long plays. And so you probably are still somewhat limited stylistically. And then if you're limited in terms of behaviorally, but yeah, the Dallas Cowboys could be in a bunch of 40-30 games that work very well for both Pickens and Lamb. And I've been a little bit of a Dak Prescott skeptic, not from the perspective that I don't think that he's good, but sometimes he's really elevated as being both a fantasy star and a reality star. in a way that certainly not being reflected this season, coming off of last year's struggles and injury. He's down there at QB 13 in the 12th round to get in redraft. And yet, when we think about these early players, then the other second-year guys that we have kind of just slid over, even though they are the really big names, every time that the Giants say that Jackson Dart is going to not play, I remember that means Malik Nabers will be catching passes from Russell Wilson. And my enthusiasm for Malik Nabers as potentially the top player in all of fantasy football just breaks into a million pieces. When we're looking at these guys in the first round, the Chase, Lamb, and then I think Puka situations versus Justin Jefferson and Malik Nabers, that gives you a little bit of heartache about what Jefferson and Nabers are kind of missing out on. And then we have Marvin Harrison here in round 3, which, I mean, similar to the situation with Odunze, might actually overstate what is really reasonable to believe about both him and his situation after that rookie year.
Yeah, it's very similar to the Odunze thing, where the rookie year was bad enough that even if he is a long-term star, year 2 may not be enough of a different situation. I mean, the connection with Kyler Murray was bad. That's got to improve. The things that really hit in fantasy football, when you think about what ceiling outcomes look like, they just gel from like week 1. They kind of blow our brains a little bit. Like right away, these guys are, oh man, these guys are on the same page as quarterback and this receiver. This offense is fantastic. The Saquon Barkley thing, you're like, oh yeah, he's a great mix with this offensive line. They're creating a bunch of space. He's eating up that space, and then he's making guys miss down the field. It's just immediately like, this is, I mean, we all remember watching that Brazil game last year on Friday night before week 1, Sunday of week 1. It's the second game of the opening, what have you. There's the Thursday night game, and then there was the Friday night game now. And Barkley just looks like this player that's super dynamic. And right after that game, everyone was saying, well, okay, is he the RB1? The rest of the drafts, the rest of the way, he was going way up there in the top 5. I was clinging to the hope that wasn't true because I didn't have any Saquon Barkley. I was like, no, he can't do this the whole year. It's just one game. But I mean, it was clear. It was apparent. He was going to be. We are looking for these situations that are so perfect that it's not just the player, but it's everything is meshing and is going great and is perfect and all of that stuff. And the Marvin Harrison situation, I mean, he's going to year 2 with a quarterback that can't see over the offensive line. I mean, there's no other way to put it, Shawn. It's been 8 years. Like, we've seen this guy really struggle to be consistently strong at reading downfield and making the throws and the plays that he needs to make. And the connection with Marvin Harrison in year 1 just was not something that I would expect 1 year later can quickly flip and justify Harrison's ADP in the middle of the 3rd round in a range where, I mean, he's going a couple spots ahead of Rashee Rice. Like, I want to get back on the Rashee Rice bandwagon. I know there's people that are worried about him coming off an injury, but what I understand about the injury, it was a little bit of a rare one, but it was one that had a less of a timeline than an ACL. It doesn't put him right in that same bucket of, what the ACL year N+1 results would indicate. Like that Rice should already be pretty far back here in May and be able to get ready for training camp and do all the things he needs to do. I don't know about all that, but I'm just speculating a little. I would be much more interested in taking Rice in the middle of the 3rd round than Harrison, who he goes behind. Xavier Worthy, who you, I think, have ranked ahead of Rice, is going in the 4th round. I mean, both of those Chiefs receivers, I think, are easier arguments to make about what they could mean. I mean, Worthy maybe wasn't so on the same page with Mahomes, but in ways that, as you talked about, I mean, they were close. And then in the postseason, he's so dynamic. He's the focal point of their offense in an AFC Championship win. And then in the Super Bowl, even though, a lot of it was after the game was decided, he has a couple long touchdowns as the Chiefs are trying to get back into it. It's not like the Eagles are just letting them have points. The Chiefs are trying to score quickly, And the Eagles are trying to prevent quick scores, and they were able to get multiple quick scores. I mean, that stuff doesn't – people are just writing that off with Xavier Worthy. Oh, it was in garbage time in the Super Bowl. I mean, I don't know. His overall body of work in the postseason and late in the year was really pretty strong. The Harrison stuff is tricky for me. You mentioned Nabers in the first round and how he fits in. I mean, the first round's tricky. It's tough because there's a lot of profiles that I want to have exposure to. The one guy that I'm starting to question a little bit is Ashton Jeanty because you're talking about not a very good offense. You're talking about, look, 2 years ago with Bijan Robinson. We do this with, he's a superstar rookie. He has an incredible profile, massive number of missed tackles forced, and all of these things that, like, he's going to be a good NFL player. I strongly believe that. He also played at a smaller school, weaker conference. Maybe some of the missed tackle force is a little bit inflated because he's playing against guys that can't tackle. I don't know. It's just, we haven't seen it at the NFL level. We're already putting him at a really, really high valuation. And yeah, I don't want to be out on Jeanty by any means. I didn't want to be out on Bijan 2 years ago, but I did wind up taking almost no Bijan in the first round because that was a year where I wanted exposure to the guys going around him. Like Amon-Ra St. Brown. Garrett Wilson was another one in the late first round that year that didn't pan out, but Amon-Ra ended up being huge. I look at it like Jeanty's going one pick ahead of Nabers. And if I get into that spot, I mean, if I'm building a running back team in the first round, I really love the Gibbs price at 105. That's probably the guy that I want to be building around. If he's off the board and Bijan and Saquon are off the board and I'm later in the first round and I have to decide between Jeanty and Nabers, I mean, I think I just want to build a wide receiver team in the first round there. Although I don't want to not have Jeanty there, but it's just this first round, these running backs I want exposure to, these receivers I want exposure to, and then especially in FFPC, I want to be building some teams that have Brock Bowers in the first round, right? Like he's going at 106, but arguably should be the 101 in this format. So it's the neighbor stuff is really tricky. I did want to circle you. I want to circle all the way back to Pickens a little bit. This, me, but you mentioned that he had really weak competition last year when you referenced Calvin Austin and a few people, Ben Skowronek, all those guys. For anyone who wasn't necessarily following that, you were referencing that Pickens did have a really weak group of competition last year in Pittsburgh. And I think it's a great point. That's why I want to circle back to it. I will note that, number one, that's a great point. The other guys didn't earn volume. Van Jefferson, none of these guys. He had 10% targets per outrun, Van Jefferson. Calvin Austin was at 15%. Both those guys ran over 375 routes. Pickens was at 436. Freiermuth led the team at 448. Mike Williams didn't play for the Steelers the whole year, but he ran over 300 routes, only out of 10% targets per route. Well, while he was with the Steelers, he wasn't earning volume either. Most of the guys running routes around Pickens weren't earning volume last year. Having said that, and Pickens' targets per route was higher as a result than his other strong recent season in 2023. Having said that, when his targets per route was a little lower in 2023, it was at 19.3%. Last year it was 22.9%, basically up at 23%. He was down below 20% in 2023, working off of Deontay Johnson, who was still there and has always been a really high targets per outrun guy, a little bit more of a target dominant number one in 2023. Pickens actually had a higher yards per outrun that year with a much lower targets per route because his yards per target was quite a bit better, presumably because he was getting the one-on-one coverage stuff that I was talking about. So you're talking about him as a jump ball player a little bit, or like a sideline player. That's part of what I love about the fit, because Lamb has to have the safety over the top. So you have to sometimes throughout a game give Pickens one-on-one, right? You have to. You can't double both. Maybe you can all day, but then I don't know. Somebody else's. I just think this 2023 season is really interesting for Pickens as far as the targets per out wasn't as good, but the yards per target was really dynamic, and the yards per out was even better than 2024. It's a lot like Higgins in that profile sense, where like there's a cap to what he can do from a market share perspective, and the question is how efficient can he be yards per target, touchdown rate after the target is earned on the targets that he does earn. But good point. I just wanted to say, like, good counterpoint as far as the the Steelers last year not really threatening any kind of target competition. He certainly has a lot more this year just with Lamb being in the offense. But behind Lamb, the rest of that group, I mean, the Steelers last year were the other group that is like, again, you have to be trying to have this bad of a like Van Jefferson should not be running this many routes. I'm sorry. We know how I feel about that.
They're like, we fixed it. We swapped out Pickens, who actually had a good year last year, for DK Metcalf, who really did not. I mean, he's one where even at his price is a little bit risky. Then I want to mention a little bit more here on Marvin Harrison, because I mean, his numbers are just so bizarre to me, where, I mean, the reason that he was drafted so early in both reality and fantasy is that he was coming off of these 2 seasons at Ohio State where he scores 14 touchdowns in each of them. He's up over 3 yards per team attempt. And we're talking about just massive efficiency numbers. And he's got that size with it as well. Probably not quite as athletic as most of the guys, that we're looking at in the first round, but certainly the size, athleticism package also impressive. And even with that, when you looked at his college numbers, and one of the reasons that I preferred Nabers is that the on-target catch percentages were actually not very good. Now, it's all within context of not very good for this guy who put up these crazy numbers. And his work with the ball in his hands to beat defenders was very poor. And so you're looking at this and thinking, well, those could be red flags, or it could be a situation where if either of those things bounce back, then you're talking about Marvin Harrison being even better. I mean, imagine the numbers he would have put up if he had caught a few more passes, if he had evaded a few tackles. I mean, they would have been mind-boggling. And that progression would have also been very reasonable when you're talking about a young, big, extremely athletic player. The sort of weird part about it is that he goes to the Cardinals. He gets stuck in this offense with Murray that seems like basically worst case scenario for him. Now, I mean, you could get stuck on a team with Anthony Richardson, or you could get stuck on the Saints or things like that would be worse still. But it's certainly not good for what his profile was going to be here. And you see a rookie season where when he caught 62 passes, evaded 1 tackle. That's virtually impossible to do. I mean, to put up a 1.6% evasion number. And again, I mean, you break a couple more and suddenly things look a little more normal-ish. You're dealing with something where, yeah, 1 or 2 plays could change how we view that. But when it's an extension of what he did as a college player, it starts to make you think that this is a real weakness, even if it can be overcome. The other thing was his on-target catch percentage was, again, terrible, right? Now, he's a 13 ADOT guy. We know it's going to be more difficult to catch some of those passes. But again, we're specifically talking about the on-target ones. And it's an interesting dynamic because both in college and then in his first year, the drop numbers are not a problem. It's more this matter of other catchable targets that are maybe a little bit trickier. And again, you're going to go look at different sources and they're going to categorize those things slightly differently. But it comes back to this element where if Harrison is mostly doing it with that sort of pre-catch athleticism and route running, and you're working with a Kyler Murray and your weaknesses are at the catch point and with the ball in your hands, it's not a good fit. Now, I think they're going to spend, the mission for this entire offseason has to be to make this offense work with the 2 of those guys together. There are fewer moving pieces in Arizona than there are for like the Chicago Bears, where like everything is in flux. I mean, the Cardinals simply have to go out and make that portion work. And I think that you can also look at the touchdown numbers kind of in either direction. Marvin Harrison had a very poor rookie season, despite the fact that he caught 8 touchdowns and Trey McBride only caught 2. I mean, you imagine how we'd be looking at it if they both caught 5. Right? I mean, the touchdowns are so valuable that it swings it quite a bit. And yet, I do think it's fair when we look at the 3 seasons together. One of the things that Blair writes about a lot, I talk about a lot, is like, don't fade touchdowns. If you could have someone who's a big touchdown scorer and they build out some of the other areas of their profile, now you're looking at a guy who's a legitimate first round pick. So I think it's a very good sign that he was able to carry forward a key element of his collegiate profile. But when we're looking at what the realistic expectations are for him now and the price, I mean, Terry McLaurin is going one spot after. I mean, Terry McLaurin is basically already doing what the best case scenario for Marvin Harrison is, or not, maybe not the 98th, 99th percentile outcome. But if Marvin Harrison were able to go out and do what Terry McLaurin is doing for the Commanders, I mean, that's basically what you're hoping for. You mentioned Rashee Rice. I mean, a lot of the other guys in this range are a little bit tricky, which is one reason why I think you could take a tight end. We talked about you could take one of these elite QBs. Certainly there are young running backs. I'm not even necessarily comfortable saying like you would have to fade Harrison in relationship to the other options. Davante Adams, when you're changing teams and you don't have Aaron Rodgers and you're competing with Puka, I mean, I feel very comfortable saying that Puka is going to step on his targets in a way that Jamar Chase and CeeDee Lamb, and even say like the Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison situation, is not as problematic. It maybe won't be quite the extent that we saw with Cooper Kupp at the end of last season, but Puka Nacua is going to get the targets. He's open every play, and I think you can want to have a more multifaceted offense all you want, but everything that we see with both what Kupp did originally and then what Nacua has done, you're talking about Matthew Stafford, you're talking about Sean McVay. Like when those games are on the line, are they going to be like, oh, let's get some other guys involved? Or is it going to be like, it's Puka, it's Puka, it's Puka?
Puka seems super fun at 110 for those reasons. And yet, you said this, it's Stafford, it's McVay and all that, because we've seen such a concentration of volume in this offense in a variety of ways. And it could be Puka and even Adams as a second player. It's another situation where everything can go to 2 guys sometimes, I mean, that happened. It hasn't happened as much with Kupp being banged up, but it happened for a stretch either in 2024 or 2023. I can't remember exactly. I'm thinking late in 2023, maybe. But even going back to, and this is a long way to go back, I know it's a different offense these days, but going back to Kupp with Robert Woods and the way that operated. And I mean, I don't think it means anything negative for Puka. I think you have to be really excited about Puka, but I do, Sean, I don't want to take 32-year-old Davante Adams coming off a year where his numbers probably only look good because he was playing with Aaron Rodgers, but I can't completely tell myself that I can't take him at all.
So one of the things that I did do, I mentioned there were some changes as I worked through everything in the Big Gorilla write-up. One of the things I realized was I did have to move Davante Adams way back up in my rankings, and I did. I still have him as a fade, but where I had him did not reflect what the different probabilities were for 20, 25 yardage, touchdowns, obviously scoring outcomes there. I mean, Kyron Williams fans will tell you that there were no passes to the running backs last year. And with Tyler Higbee out, you didn't get the literally 2-yard passes to Higbee over and over and over and over. It will be interesting to see if there's a Jarquez Hunter element to the offense. It will be interesting to see if Terrence Ferguson is one of these guys where, Ben, I keep kind of going back and forth on him. I was regretting from my rookie drafts that I didn't really get any. And it was because every single time I would go back and look at him, I think that Terrence Ferguson could be the Rams' answer to George Kittle. And then I would look at the overall profiles of Fannin and Ferguson side by side. And I'd be like, man, you're taking a massive jump down in terms of what a player has actually done to select Ferguson. So I didn't get much exposure there. It kind of wraps back around to, partly we probably would feel somewhat comfortable just having 100% Rashee Rice if that's actually what it came down to. But take him out of there, you're staring at Marvin Harrison and Davante Adams, two very different types of profiles. A guy you're hoping makes a second-year leap and a guy you're hoping doesn't fall off the cliff. Who do you pick when you're on the clock there?
That's a really good question. I think I'm taking Marvin Harrison. I think I'm playing into the uncertainty enough, and I think with Harrison, there's enough of a like. I was talking about some of the weird stuff related to Pickens off field and whatnot. I think maybe some of year one with Harrison was just a little bit of like there's a really high expectations and maybe some off field whatever. I think there's a potential for a year two rebound in factors that are just like impossible to quantify as far as like effort and things like that. Like there was some talk that there wasn't much effort with Harrison as early as week one. Remember week one, they were saying the GPS data didn't clock him getting over like 16 miles per hour or something the whole game. It's like, why is this happening in week one? Like, why are you already not trying?
He's like, I don't know if you understand when week one happened. It happened after I had like 30 practices with these guys. I knew what Kyler Murray was going to
do. I mean, I think it could be the case that Harrison's effort was really, really bad. And then he just has I think sometimes in the sophomore year stuff, you have a really good offseason and you are just a really good. He's still the difference between him and Odunze, and I'm not really telling myself that big of a story with Odunze, is you pointed out there were some real red flags in Odunze's profile. Harrison's profile, 3-year early declare, 2 years of really, really dominant target earning production, really, really dominant overall production. People thought he was like a generational overall prospect, et cetera. I don't love his cost again this year in the third round, but you're going to make me pick between him and Adams, who I just got done saying I like, but I started digging into Adams' numbers here. And one of the things I think it needs to be said is, his yards per target really declined. The after the target efficiency really declined in 2023, but the targets per route stayed strong. So he still had a pretty good yards per out run, but it wasn't as good as his peak, which was like 2019 to 2022, like a 4-year really good peak of 2.3 plus yards per out. He's right around 2 in 2023. He's right around 2 again in 2024, in part because his yards per target rebounded a little bit. It was still weaker than his peak. And his targets per route, the point I'm trying to make here, it actually cratered last year relative to his prior 5 years. It was a full percentage point below his weakest number in that 5-year span and more like 3 to 4 percentage points below most of the seasons. And yet that's the year last year we're talking about he was playing with Rodgers and Rodgers was sort of force feeding him down the stretch with the Jets. And he had a couple big plays with them. One I remember was like on a drag route with just a completely broken play, just had a bunch of room to run. I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a little bit more concern in the 2024 numbers than I think people would look at his overall production and say he was still productive last year. He still put up numbers with the Jets. His targets per out was pretty weak, even despite playing with Rodgers and almost, being force-fed from, his buddy there. The yards per target now 2 years in a row where it's been sub 8, which it hadn't been since the very early years of his career. So I don't know.
To look at that I had mentioned in the article was that he used to be one of these guys who, massive, massive target share, right? But also huge fantasy points over expected numbers. Mm-hmm. And that's how you go on this stretch where, like, for a decade, you're this unstoppable juggernaut, right? Now, basically for the same reasons you're talking about, back-to-back seasons with negative FPOE. And that included the post-trade period where he put up enough other negative FPOE that it canceled out that 19.7 that he got in the week 15 explosion against Jacksonville that killed a lot of us who didn't have it.
Yeah.
Sprints and what have you. But even with that, it was problematic. Now, again, you can be Davante Adams and have a massive collapse and still be much more valuable than all of these guys who are just starting from such a completely different area that they're just incomparable, right? They're just not remotely the same thing. And yet you're going to get that collapse because those targets just will not be there with Puka and without Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah. I think that's such a great way of putting it, though, that, you can be Adam. It was really reminiscent to me of, I think it was 2 years ago, Sean, when I look at these targets per out run profiles and these things, and I was talking a lot about Keenan and Mike Evans, who are two other, multi-year, really, really good players, right? Like perennial all-pro wide receivers. They showed a little bit of decline. They rebounded a little bit after that, and we were really in on both Keenan and Evans as options going into 2023. That was the year Evans was going behind Godwin in the 7th or 8th round. I was really into Godwin too, but I was taking both of them quite a bit. And in Baker's first year there. And anyway, I'm trying to figure out the quarterback situation. I think earlier in the show I said that Baker was new to Tampa last year or something. Anyway, he's been there 2 years. But Evans was, and
I think the listeners had corrected it all.
They
understood where you were coming from.
Yeah, I'm just figuring it out now. But yeah, Evans and Keenan that year. Listeners over multiple years will remember 2023 and us being willing to take some of these older receivers. They were guys who, like you said, because they had started from such strong numbers, they showed some signs of decline, but then some stabilizing. We're like, okay, these guys are good cost-adjusted plays. They were also quite a bit cheaper. When we got into them that summer, a little bit different than Adams right now going in the 3rd round. That's the part of it that's tricky for me, especially when you think about, again, it's not can Adams beat this price. He can. Anyone can beat their ADP, honestly. Like, there's enough of a market element that no one's going to be priced in a range where they're that asymmetrical of a bet where they can't beat their price. Yeah, they can. The point is we're looking for outliers, league winners, the guys that can define the season. Marvin Harrison could be that, even though I don't love the bet. I think it's a lot harder for me to see that with Adams, and that's the part of it where I toy with it. I think it would require a Puka injury, and then it's like it has to be Adams, and they get, and Adams is get a little bit of fountain of youth. He is having a good, age 32 season, but he really connects with Stafford. I think that type of story I could tell, but I really do, to your point, I think it's going to be Puka, and I think it would require Puka being off the field, because I just don't see alongside Puka how Adams could be dominant enough or productive enough at a 3rd round cost to be worth the risk you're taking on, the age cliff-related risk with these multiple years of kind of declining trends. He probably could be a small hit. He probably can score 10 touchdowns and have a good, 1,000+ yards and have a good season, because of the way the offense is structured, the way that Matthew Stafford is a fantastic quarterback for wide receiver production. He could probably score like a round 2 wide receiver. I don't know if he can score like a top 5 wide receiver or, top 5 overall player. And if I'm taking a guy in the 3rd round, I want to tell myself he can score like a top 5 overall player. So I guess I can tell. I think Adams would be more likely to be a small hit than Marvin Harrison. Again, getting back to that discussion, Harrison would be, though, for me, more likely to really be the big hit in the 3rd round that you kind of need to find there. But to your point, you pulled Rashee Rice out of this discussion from me. I think Rashee Rice is the guy that can be the top 5 player in that conversation. I think he could be a really nice hit. Again, the way that he was like a 29% targets per route guy before he got hurt. He was taking over all the Travis Kelce stuff. They did add Jalen Royals, who you love. They also get Hollywood Brown back. The way that Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy operate in different kind of depths and things. I don't know that it's going to overlap too much with what Rice was doing, which was more similar to what Kelce was doing in that offense. But Royals has been called, a very similar player to Rice. He's the one that could be a little bit of a threat. Anyway, you can see scenarios where if last year's small sample before his injury is indicative of what they're going to try to get from him in 2025, and he's able to answer that bell from a health perspective, if he does anything like what he did in 2024 for a longer stretch, he's clearly a guy that can be a top 5 overall player. You mentioned Tyreek Hill on our last show, too. He's going right there in the middle of the 3rd. There's some interesting names there.
We know Tyreek Hill can do it. We also know that he is character. And so I think Tyreek Hill will end up rising quite a bit as we go through. People are just going to get back to where they're like, I can't pass on what the ceiling obviously is in this particular offense. It probably makes, I think you've got to take into consideration both the problems they ran into last year, which were multifaceted, right? They had extreme blocking problems. They also had design problems where people had figured out what they were doing, getting the receivers open for the yards after the catch. Once you add and then unlock a Jonnu Smith, that doesn't just go back into the box either. So, there are a lot of risks with Hill, and yet when you have done what he's done and you have that kind of speed in a well-designed offense, the upside is extreme. Ben, as you were talking about Rashee Rice there, I did want to ask a question that hopefully has some additional kind of global appeal beyond just the Chiefs. But specifically with the Chiefs, we were pretty high on what they could do from a full team passing perspective last year. And then it was actually very difficult to evaluate because two of the key pieces in Rashee Rice and Hollywood Brown miss almost the entire season. Now, I've kind of gotten to the point where I really question if Hollywood Brown has any relevance at all, and if he even would have had any relevance last year. But it is interesting now that we have these guys not only on the team, but you also have them with years of experience in pocket, right? So regardless of how quickly you thought Xavier Worthy was going to adapt last season, and, if he catches a few of those touchdowns we referenced, then people are, oh, he got it right away. He certainly had it going in many ways by the end. Certainly Rashee Rice, end of year one and the beginning of year two, had it going, right? You're into that situation where the experience is starting to unlock things. Although I do have to say that one of the things when they contrast Royals and Rashee Rice, they still kind of mention that Rashee Rice had a lot to work on as a route runner. And it's almost mentioning it in a way where they're like, he still does. And so, that might raise a tiny eyebrow for me. But when you have these guys now simultaneously on the team, you probably will get a little bit underneath from Travis Kelce. You might get that same sort of arc from Jalen Royals that you got from Rice and Worthy. I know they were drafted in different spots, but there's some evidence to suggest that Royals is just, again, very similar to those two guys in terms of the actual quality of the prospect. They've been referencing some of those things, but those things are not just things where the team's like, well, let's, back up our pick. You really got the impression they were not planning to select a receiver. And then when he was there, they're like, this is a multi-round value. You got to make the pick. We were excited last year about Houston. We were excited last year about Kansas City. I was excited about the Packers. One of the reasons why you want to build a ton of redundancy into everything that you're doing by redundancy, you need to build so many different ways to win, and you need to build so much excess in terms of what you think you're getting right, because you're going to get more wrong, or you're going to get key things wrong that just shocks you in terms of how the seasons actually play out. I mean, I would feel very comfortable going back in time and being enthusiastic about those offenses again. Ben, I probably am wrong. I'm pretty enthusiastic about those offenses for 2025. It does seem like, though, that the Packers offense and the Texans offense will probably still need to be developmental from the perspective of mostly what we're hoping is that Jordan Love bounces back. They actually pass. Jaden Reed looks good. Matthew Golden looks good. If you have other favorites, certainly Tucker Kraft looks good. And that they move back in the right direction. For the Texans, you're hoping that C.J. Stroud, C.J. Stroud's second best boom rate in the NFL as a rookie. That seems like the real him. You have that with Nico Collins healthy, with these new awesome rookies. You're probably still thinking, though, about a move mostly to gain those losses back. With the Chiefs, could we have them bouncing all the way back? It's just, every time I go and look at it, I'm stunned by like how massive the size is when we're looking at what Patrick Mahomes did early in his career. Because right now, you're basically like, oh, I mean, passing quarterbacks are not viable for fantasy. I mean, Joe Burrow's going early, but he probably shouldn't because he had like the very best case scenario season, and it still was only like pretty good. Those early career seasons for Patrick Mahomes are extraordinary. Defenses have changed, but one of the things with the Chiefs is just they let their offensive personnel deteriorate to where it was nothing, and then they had these injuries. On the Chiefs or any of those other teams, if they're more interesting to you, do you feel comfortable, not saying it's guaranteed or anything, but really factoring in a decent likelihood for them to not just bounce back, but to leap into this Bengals range, knowing that partly what happened with the Bengals is just that their defense was so bad that you have to make certain types of decisions when that's the case? I'm struggling with it because it seems like the pieces are there. We're saying, should it be Rashee Rice? Should it be Xavier Worthy? Could it be both and additional pieces? I don't know. I'm too close to it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think Hollywood Brown could be more involved than I think most people seem to think. They've tended to, over the years, sort of defer to the veteran types. I think they wanted Brown to be involved last year. He gets hurt. He never really is fully healthy, but he comes back this year to kind of run it back. And now you get a second offseason kind of working with him because you did work with him all offseason, and then he got hurt in week 1. And the stuff that they've done with like DeMarcus Valdes-Scantling and Juju Smith-Schuster and those various guys throughout the years where they've tended to prioritize a certain type of veteran presence or something. I don't know. I feel like Hollywood Brown might get a little bit more deference from the coaching staff and the structure than he's one that worries me a little bit as far as the real bowl cases for Rice and Xavier Worthy. Then obviously, I mean, if Kelsey has a decent year, he had 90+ catches last year. I mean, we're all talking like Travis Kelsey's done. He caught 90+ passes last year. Like, this is not.
But it was a cliff outcome from an efficiency perspective, which then usually foreshadows a cliff outcome from a volume perspective.
And right? I'm not denying that.
I mean, it's gonna.
Yeah, no.
I mean, totally in order for them to have the kind of season I'm talking about, Travis Kelsey would have to go away because it's just not efficient enough to lose. I mean, he in some ways is like now their version of David Montgomery, where you're just like, man, those plays out of the offense really hurt us.
I completely agree. But again, like it was 97 catches. Bowers and McBride were both over 110. He's third in the league at tight end. Jonnu has 88. Kittle has 78. No one else has more than 66. There's only 5 tight ends in the league last year that had more than 66 catches. And Kittle was at 97. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, but am I 100% certain that he's not going to catch 75 balls this year? And that would be a big deal.
But Patrick Mahomes would tell you, look, once Rashee Rice and Hollywood Brown got hurt, my weapons were worse than what the Lampoon Pittsburgh Steelers were dealing with.
Yeah, no, it wasn't good for Kansas City. I the answer is tough. And as you were talking about the Mahomes stuff the last 2 years, I don't think it's on Mahomes. I don't think he's bad. There's so many people that talk about his declining ADOT and what he's become as a passer and this, that, and the other thing. I mean, just a couple of years ago in 2022, he had 5,200 yards, which is one of the. He's thrown for over 5,000 yards twice. There's not a ton of 5,000-yard seasons all time. I mean, it's 5,250 yards that year. Not only led the league that year, but it's one of the all-time high single season totals. That was 2022, and that was a year where his ADOT was lower. But then the very next year, 2023, he's at 4,183 passing yards, more than 1,000 less. And last year, he didn't even throw for 4,000. He had 3,928 in 16 games. Now they go 15-1 in those 16 games, but maybe a little bit more pushback from some opposing teams and things like that. You're not going to go 15-1 every year, right? Like they had some things, although a lot of those wins were close late. They had some games that they won on late field goals, games that their opponent lost on late opportunities and didn't convert.
Well, one of the most noteworthy was the Denver game. The first one, obviously, the second one they tanked. Do you think that the gains by the Broncos and the Chargers will in any way influence them that just wouldn't already be the influence of knowing you've got to beat Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson?
Maybe.
I mean, probably not, right? I mean, you're thinking about the caliber of team that could beat those guys and then beat the Eagles in the Super Bowl. You're not thinking, okay, we could rest on our laurels. It'll probably be fine.
Yeah, I think they're not specifically concerned about their division. I'm sure they're worried about it, and they're worried about the teams in their division, but it's almost like a bigger fish to fry thing where, like, I think they're focused on, as you said, the Bills and the Ravens and the Eagles in the Super Bowl and being the best team in football. But yeah, I mean, just the ways that they do things in season. As you were talking about it, I was thinking about Tom Brady's career and how with the Patriots, they had a couple different eras, and the big first passing explosions when they got Wes Welker and Randy Moss in like the late 00s. And then I pulled up his numbers. There's a little stretch in, I guess, in 2009, 2010, his passing numbers maybe not quite as dominant. 2010 he won MVP, but he didn't even throw for 4,000 yards. They went 14-2. He did lead the league in passing touchdowns with 36 that year. But 2011 he comes back and has a 5,200 yard passing year. That's the Gronk rookie season, I think, in 2011. I guess the point I'm making is, the all-time greatest quarterback has this really long career. He did have some seasons where the personnel wasn't maybe as great and they didn't necessarily have to throw quite as much to win. And then there's other seasons where, yeah, that was the Gronk rookie year. He has 1,300 yards, 17 touchdowns. Aaron Hernandez is there, has 79 catches and 910 yards as a secondary piece. And they still had Wes Welker, who led the league with 122 catches, 1,500 yards. And he throws for 5,200 yards that year, 4,800 the next year. Then the next couple of years, 4,300, 4,100. That's in like 2013, 2014, probably a couple of the years where Gronk was banged up. Then he's back with 4,700 in 2015. I mean, I guess it like if you go look at Drew Brees' career, it was the same every year. He was like 5,000 passing yards every year. But Brady's is, I guess, to me, the way that the Patriots offense went through some eras and some different personnel changes and building around him and finding new ways to compete every couple of years. They were competitive every year, but new ways every couple of years is a little bit reminiscent of what we've started to see in this era of the Chiefs. And the point being that maybe the 4,800, 5,200 yard passing season does just come back and erupt. I thought that was possible last year because we talked about this all last offseason. It felt like that's what they were going for. They were actually really trying to address the receiving corps. They went out and drafted Xavier Worthy in the first round. They had already added Hollywood Brown. And Rashee Rice, we felt like, was a good bet to make a year 2 jump and all of these things. And then they had all the injuries in, as you mentioned. It was kind of bad midseason. Now they also add Jalen Royals. You said, you didn't even get a feeling that they were trying to add a receiver, but maybe their pick prior, they're like, God, this Jalen Royals is pretty high on our board. We got to consider him. And then he makes it all the way back to their next pick. And like you said, they're going, okay, it's multi-round value at this point. We got to take him. I think it's possible. Every year is different in the ways that teams approach things, what their motivations are. I think it's... especially the way that the season ended last year in the Super Bowl, I think it's possible the Chiefs come out with a little bit more of a chip on their shoulder. Like last year, I think was about the three-peat. It was about like just get wins in the regular season and go win a Super Bowl. The three-peat's gone now, right? Like it can't happen. You can't win the three-peat in 2025. I think they'll have a renewed focus in the postseason when that comes around. But I also think, again, with the focus being the three-peat to some degree, especially when they started having the injuries in the passing game, their decision last season was, look, let's just keep winning games, which they were doing. Let's get the 1 seed. Let's get, out of the AFC and get to the Super Bowl again. It just seems like this year as I think through it, as you asked me that question, I think it's possible that it's a little bit more of a statement year. It's a little bit more of the new era, a second new era, if you will, the first good passing season, post Tyreek Hill, if you will. It'll be interesting to see. I guess not the first good passing season because the 1,500-yard year was post Tyreek Hill. But anyway, the way that Brady's season kind of ebbed and flowed, we'll see. We'll see if that can happen with Mahomes. I don't know. It's possible. I don't know what to make of it. I really don't either.
I think we're going to get a handful of offenses in 2026 that are extremely successful making adjustments. I think that if you were betting on some of those offenses last year and were disappointed, try not to be so burned that it overwhelms the different pieces of information that you have to evaluate what's likely to happen here. We've got some great post-hype options, both at the player level, but also the team level. Ben will be going into much more of that as we get deeper into the summer. It was much fun talking with you today about some of these young wide receivers and wide receiver values early in redraft for 2025. That'll be it for today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are subscribed to the Stealing Signals newsletter, one of the standout sports blogs over there on Substack. Substack, Ben, getting to be like the thing taking over the writing world. That is bengretch.substack.com. Love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Coupon code RVRadio2025 at checkout. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.